On July 12, 1985, at 2:47 post-meridiem, he was at Central Intelligence Agency headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The air conditioning struggled with the July heat. James Wolcott Miller Jr. felt sweat gather beneath the collar of his new Brooks Brothers dress shirt. His mother had bought the shirt for his first day at Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. He was 22 years old, fresh from Stanford University with dual degrees in computer science and Russian studies. Now he sat in a beige cubicle in the Office of Communications. Through the reinforced window, he could see the parking lot shimmering in the heat. His used Honda Civic was already baking in the afternoon sun. His father's Federal Bureau of Investigation credentials had helped him through the first round of interviews. His own brilliance had accomplished the rest. The blue badge on his desk was still warm from the lamination machine. It signified top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance. This was the highest clearance in the intelligence community. He had received it in record time, in just 6 weeks. The background investigators had barely scratched the surface. They had interviewed his father, Special Agent James Miller Sr. The elder Miller was a 23-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Washington field office. The investigators also spoke with his professors at Stanford University. They reviewed his academic records, his financial history, and his travel to Europe during his junior year abroad. Everything came back clean, even perfect. They wrote in their assessment that he was the son of a patriot. They noted his exceptional analytical capabilities and recommended him without reservation. However, the investigators had not looked closely at the 3-inch Moleskine notebook he carried everywhere. The black leather notebook was worn at the edges. It appeared to be filled with class notes and mathematical equations. Miller touched the notebook now, sitting beside his new computer terminal. Inside, there were 63 pages of carefully encoded observations about security procedures at various government facilities. He had been preparing for this moment since his sophomore year at Stanford University. A visiting professor from Moscow State University had first approached him then at a campus coffee shop. The professor complimented his Russian pronunciation and asked innocent questions about his father's work. His supervisor, a chain-smoking analyst named Patricia Hammond, appeared at his cubicle entrance. She carried a stack of manila folders, each stamped with red diagonal stripes. She announced that this was his first assignment as she dropped the folders on his desk with a dull thud. The assignment involved satellite communication protocols for the Keyhole program. She explained that he would review encryption standards for the new KH-11 constellation. Hammond noted it was tedious work, but someone needed to verify the algorithms before transmission. She paused, studying his face, and asked if he was nervous due to first-day jitters. Miller forced a smile. He stated he was just excited to get started. Hammond nodded, already turning away. She reminded him that the files did not leave the room. She added that everything needed to be locked in the safe at the end of business. She then disappeared into her own office. Miller remained alone with the classified documents. He opened the first folder. Inside was a technical schematic marked Talent, Keyhole, Restricted Handling. His hands were not shaking, which surprised him. He had imagined this moment would feel more dramatic, more consequential. Instead, it felt inevitable. He pulled the notebook from his pocket and flipped to a blank page. Then he began writing down numbers. These included launch trajectories, orbital parameters, and communication frequencies. This was the data that would change everything. Across the Potomac River, in a 7th-floor apartment in Arlington, a Soviet intelligence officer was preparing for his regular Friday afternoon jog. His name was Valentin Sergeyevich Aksilenko. He had lived in Washington for 18 months. Officially, he worked as a cultural attaché at the Soviet embassy. In reality, he ran a network of sources. This network included 2 State Department clerks, a defense contractor's secretary, and now a brilliant young analyst. The officer did not yet know about the analyst, who had just started his first day at Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. In 4 hours, Aksilenko would receive a phone call. This call would activate the most valuable recruitment of his career. The code phrase would be simple. It would state that the Columbia bookstore had the Russian dictionary he ordered. His response would confirm that he would pick it up the next day after work. For now, Miller had real work to do. He needed to perform well enough to avoid suspicion. He also needed to perform brilliantly enough to gain access to more sensitive material. The KH-11 satellite specifications spread across his desk represented the most advanced reconnaissance technology in existence. These included cameras powerful enough to read license plates from orbit. Infrared sensors were capable of detecting missile launches from space. Signals intelligence packages could intercept communications across the entire Soviet Union. Every detail mattered, including every frequency, every encryption key, and every technical limitation. Outside his window, a construction crew was pouring concrete for a new parking structure. The sound of machinery drifted up to the third floor. This included the steady rumble of mixers, the beeping of trucks backing up, and the shouted instructions of foremen. These were the normal sounds of a normal summer afternoon. Nobody knew that the Cold War's most damaging espionage case had just begun. It started in a beige cubicle with a view of construction equipment and a sweating Honda Civic. Miller made his first notation at 3:14 post-meridiem. By 5:30 post-meridiem, Patricia Hammond reminded him to lock everything in the safe. He had memorized 14 pages of technical specifications by then. He had also filled 6 pages of his notebook with encoded information. He said goodnight to his co-workers. He rode the elevator down to the lobby. Then he walked through security, scanning his badge for the last time that day. He drove home through rush-hour traffic on the George Washington Parkway. His hands were steady on the wheel. His breathing was normal. He felt nothing except a strange sense of completion, as if his entire life had been preparation for this moment. The black notebook sat in his briefcase. 43 new observations had been added to the existing 63. He planned to add more the next day and the day after that. For the next 18 months, James Wolcott Miller Jr. would systematically betray every satellite program. He would also betray every communication system and every technical advantage. The United States intelligence community had spent billions of dollars developing these. Nobody would suspect him until it was far too late. The official story begins with numbers because numbers do not lie, even when everything else does. In 1985, the United States intelligence community employed approximately 150,000 people. These employees worked across 17 agencies. The Central Intelligence Agency alone had a budget of $3.5 billion. Nearly half of this budget was spent on technical collection. This was the polite term for spy satellites, reconnaissance aircraft, and signals intelligence stations scattered across the globe. The crown jewel of this technical empire was the Keyhole program. Specifically, this referred to the KH-11 Kennan satellites launched between 1976 and 1990. These were not the primitive cameras of earlier reconnaissance satellites. The KH-11 represented a technological leap. It offered real-time digital imagery with near photographic quality. It also provided the ability to see through clouds using infrared sensors. The first KH-11 had cost $1.3 billion to develop and build. Each subsequent satellite cost another $300 million. By July 1985, 4 KH-11 satellites were operational in orbit. Their cameras and sensors provided the intelligence foundation for every major strategic decision the United States made. These decisions specifically regarded Soviet military capabilities. The security around these programs was suffocating. The KH-11 specifications existed in a classification category so sensitive it had its own code name. This was Talent Keyhole, shortened to TK. To access TK materials, one needed special clearances beyond top secret. Access was logged, monitored, and restricted to specific secure facilities. Rooms where TK materials could be read had reinforced walls. They also featured white noise generators to prevent acoustic surveillance. Alarm systems connected directly to security response teams. The documents themselves were numbered, tracked, and inventoried daily. In theory, nobody could steal this information without triggering immediate detection. James Miller Sr. had served in the Federal Bureau of Investigation for 23 years. He specialized in Soviet counterintelligence. He had worked spy cases, recruited defectors, and testified before congressional committees. These testimonies concerned KGB operations in the United States. His personnel file contained commendations from 3 Federal Bureau of Investigation directors. His colleagues described him as meticulous, patriotic, and occasionally obsessive about security protocols. When his son applied for a Central Intelligence Agency position in early 1985, the background investigation treated the family connection as an asset. They did not consider it a liability. The elder Miller had raised his son to understand the importance of national security. He had exposed him to the reality of Soviet aggression. He had also taught him Russian so that he could understand the enemy. The investigators saw a young man shaped by a father's dedication to protecting American secrets. They did not see the other side of that equation. This was a young man who had spent his entire childhood learning exactly how American secrets were protected. He learned where the weaknesses were and how the system actually worked. The recruitment had happened 18 months earlier, during Miller Jr.'s junior year at Stanford University. The visiting professor's real name was Mikhail Leonidovich Svetlov. He was a senior officer in the KGB's first chief directorate. Svetlov had been running talent spotting operations on American campuses for 11 years. His method was patient, subtle, and devastatingly effective. He never approached students directly about espionage. Instead, he identified promising candidates and built relationships over months. He also assessed their vulnerabilities, their ideologies, and their ambitions. With Miller, Svetlov recognized something unusual. This was not an ideologue who hated America, nor a mercenary motivated purely by money. Instead, it was an arrogant genius who believed he was smarter than the system in which he had grown up. The conversations had been philosophical at first. They discussed whether the Cold War was necessary. They also debated if intelligence work actually prevented conflict or perpetuated it. Furthermore, they considered if secrecy served democracy or undermined it. Svetlov never asked for information. He never mentioned the KGB. He simply created space for Miller to articulate his own doubts and resentments. For example, his father had spent decades chasing Soviet spies. Yet his government salary could not pay for Miller's Stanford University tuition without student loans. Central Intelligence Agency leadership included political appointees with no technical expertise. These appointees made decisions about billion-dollar satellite programs they did not understand. Miller also resented that talented analysts like him would spend careers generating intelligence. Politicians would then ignore this intelligence whenever it contradicted their predetermined policies. By the time Svetlov made the actual proposition, Miller had already rationalized his decision. The proposition was framed not as espionage. Instead, it was presented as helping both sides understand each other to prevent accidental war. Miller believed he was not betraying his country. He thought he was correcting an imbalance. He intended to share information that would make both superpowers more cautious and more rational. The money was almost incidental. However, the $50,000 initial payment certainly helped with his student loans. What motivated him more was the intellectual challenge. He also enjoyed the secret knowledge that he was operating at a level far beyond his peers. He believed he was manipulating the very system designed to catch people like him. The Soviet secret police gave him instructions so simple they seemed almost casual. Do not volunteer for sensitive positions. Let them come to you. Do not try to access information outside your assigned work. Only report what you naturally encounter. Do not make copies or take photographs. Memorize what you can. Write down the rest in coded form. Use dead drops for passing information. Never meet handlers directly. Stay under the radar. Be patient. The best sources were those nobody suspected. Avoiding suspicion meant being genuinely good at his job. Miller followed these instructions perfectly. When he graduated from Stanford in the spring of 1985, he applied to several intelligence agencies. The Central Intelligence Agency offered him a position first. The background investigation moved quickly. His father's connections and his own clean record facilitated this process. The investigators looked for obvious red flags. These included foreign contacts, financial problems, character issues, or signs of disloyalty. Miller had none of these issues. His foreign contacts consisted of academic relationships developed through legitimate study. His finances were typical for a recent graduate, showing some debt but nothing unusual. His character references were glowing. His loyalty seemed unquestionable. He was the son of a career Federal Bureau of Investigation counterintelligence agent, following in his father's footsteps. His psychology remained uninvestigated. This included his arrogance and his need to prove his superior intelligence. His quiet resentment of a system he knew too well also went unnoticed. Such traits did not appear in background checks or polygraph examinations. They remained invisible until they truly mattered. On July 12, 1985, Miller received his blue badge. He then walked into Central Intelligence Agency headquarters for the first time. The Soviet Union knew almost nothing about KH-11 satellite capabilities. They knew the satellites existed. After all, one cannot hide a rocket launch from a superpower with its own space program. They knew the satellites provided reconnaissance imagery. However, the specific technical capabilities remained murky. How good were the cameras? What wavelengths could the sensors detect? How did the encryption systems work? What were the satellite orbits, and how could they be predicted? These questions represented intelligence gaps that cost the Soviet Union billions of dollars in defensive countermeasures. They had to assume worst-case scenarios. This meant hardening military facilities against photographic reconnaissance they might not actually need. It also meant developing camouflage techniques for weapons systems that might not be detectable anyway. Furthermore, they limited communications that might not have been intercepted. The geopolitical stakes were enormous. The Reagan administration pursued a massive military buildup. This was justified partly by intelligence about Soviet weapons programs gathered by KH-11 satellites. If the Soviets knew exactly what American satellites could see, they could conceal crucial programs. They could also reveal programs that made them look more threatening. This would manipulate American perceptions and policy decisions. They could time military exercises to avoid satellite coverage. They could deploy weapons systems to locations the satellites could not effectively monitor. The intelligence advantage would shift. With it, the entire balance of deterrence would also shift, potentially turning the Cold War into a hot war. Patricia Hammond, Miller's supervisor, had worked in satellite analysis for 14 years. She started as a junior photo interpreter during the final years of the KH-ROH-NA program. She examined grainy black-and-white photographs of Soviet missile sites. The KH-11 represented a revolution she had watched unfold. This was the transition from film returned in capsules to digital imagery transmitted in real time. She understood the technology's value, but also its limitations. Satellites followed predictable orbits. Cloud cover often obscured imagery. Encryption systems had vulnerabilities that needed constant attention. Her job involved managing a team of analysts. They reviewed these systems, identified problems, and recommended improvements. She needed people who understood both the technical details and the strategic context. Miller's file suggested he was exactly that kind of analyst. What she did not know was Miller had spent his first afternoon memorizing the exact radio frequencies for satellite downlink communications. He also memorized the specific encryption algorithms protecting the data streams. Furthermore, he learned the orbital parameters that determined when KH-11 satellites passed over Soviet territory. This information was not contained in a single document. It was scattered across 14 separate files. Each file was classified at a different level. Each contained one piece of a larger puzzle. Miller's genius lay in recognizing the pattern. He assembled the pieces. He understood how everything connected. By the time he locked his safe at 5:30 post-meridian, he could have drawn a complete technical diagram of the KH-11 communication system from memory. This was the most closely guarded secret in American intelligence. The next morning, July 13th, Miller arrived at his apartment complex's laundry room at 6:45 ante-meridian. Most residents were still asleep. Behind the industrial washing machines taped to the wall was a small magnetic key holder. This spot was invisible from the doorway. People typically use such holders to hide spare car keys. Inside the holder was a rolled piece of paper with coordinates written in Cyrillic. This indicated the location of his first dead drop. It was a drainage culvert in Great Falls Park, 14 miles from his apartment. He memorized the numbers. He then burned the paper in his kitchen sink and drove to work. That evening, after dark, he would make the first delivery of information. This information would eventually compromise every satellite reconnaissance program the United States operated. The dead drop location had been selected with care that bordered on artistry. Great Falls Park sits along the Virginia side of the Potomac River. It is a wilderness preserve where the river narrows. The river also drops 76 feet through a series of jagged rock formations. The park draws hikers, kayakers, and tourists photographing the waterfalls. However, certain areas remain isolated even during busy seasons. These include trails that lead away from the main attractions. Drainage culverts channel rainwater toward the river. These are spaces where someone could pause unobserved for 30 seconds and leave a package behind. Miller reached the park at 8:47 post-meridian. He parked in the nearly empty, difficult-run trail lot. July evening light filtered through the canopy, turning everything amber and green. He wore running clothes, shorts, a Stanford track team t-shirt, and new Nike running shoes. His appearance suggested a young professional squeezing in exercise after work. The small plastic bag in his zippered pocket suggested something else entirely. He ran for 23 minutes, following the trail as it wound along the river. He passed 3 other joggers and one couple walking a golden retriever. The drainage culvert appeared exactly where the coordinates indicated. It was a concrete pipe 18 inches in diameter. Partially hidden by undergrowth, it was too small for people to enter. However, it was large enough to reach inside. Miller slowed to a walk, breathing hard from the run. He crouched beside the trail as if tying his shoe. His right hand reached into the culvert. He found the interior ledge and placed the plastic bag there. The bag contained 6 pages of encoded information about KH-11 communication frequencies. The entire motion took 8 seconds. Then he was up and running again, continuing the loop back to the parking lot. The information Miller delivered that night represented 3 years of American technological development. It also represented approximately $400 million in research and engineering, a significant investment of public funds. The communication frequencies were not random. They had been selected to avoid interference with commercial satellites. They also aimed to minimize vulnerability to jamming and to maximize data transmission rates from orbit to ground stations. Changing those frequencies would make the entire system vulnerable. The Soviets could target jamming at the exact wavelengths the satellites used. They could develop countermeasures that degraded the satellite signals. They could even, in theory, inject false data into the communication stream. This would make American intelligence analysts see manipulated imagery instead of reality. Valentin Axilenko retrieved the package 47 minutes later at 9:34 post-meridian. He did so during his own evening jog along the same trail. He had been in position since 8:15 post-meridian. From a concealed vantage point 200 yards away, he watched the culvert. He made sure nobody else had discovered it. He also confirmed Miller had followed protocol perfectly. The retrieval was equally quick. He paused beside the trail, reached his hand into the concrete pipe, and transferred the small plastic bag to his own zippered pocket. He had run 5 miles by the time he returned to his Arlington apartment. There, he photographed each page under specialized lighting. This lighting revealed both the visible text and any potential markings invisible to the naked eye. These were precautions in case Miller had been compromised and was working under Federal Bureau of Investigation control. The photographed pages went into a diplomatic pouch that evening. It was sealed with wax and stamped with embassy credentials. This made it immune to customs inspection. Within 36 hours, the information reached Moscow Center. This was the headquarters of the Soviet Secret Police's first chief directorate. Technical analysts there began assessing its value. They recognized immediately what they had received. This was not vague intelligence about satellite capabilities. This was precise, technical data. It was the kind that came from someone with direct access to classified specifications. The source was either extraordinarily valuable or an elaborate provocation. They needed more information to determine which. Miller's second week at Central Intelligence Agency headquarters established his reputation as an exceptional analyst. He identified a vulnerability in the encryption protocol that nobody else had noticed. This was a mathematical quirk that could potentially allow decryption if an adversary captured enough signal samples. His memo on the subject went up the chain of command. It impressed supervisors who had expected him to need months to reach that level of insight. Patricia Hammond recommended him for expanded access to satellite communication specifications. The security office approved without hesitation. After all, he had already demonstrated his value. His background check had revealed nothing concerning. His father called to congratulate him on making such a strong first impression. What Hammond and the security officers did not know was that Miller had deliberately inserted one minor error into his encryption vulnerability memo. This was a small mathematical mistake that did not invalidate his overall conclusion. However, it would allow Soviet analysts to identify which encryption protocols remained fully secure. The memo became part of the official Central Intelligence Agency record. It was accessible to hundreds of cleared personnel. It was impossible to trace back to Miller specifically. This provided the perfect cover. He could deliver valuable intelligence to the Soviet secret police. Simultaneously, he built his reputation as a talented analyst who was helping protect American secrets. The dead drop system operated on a precise schedule. Miller made deliveries every 17 days. This was irregular enough to avoid pattern recognition. It was also frequent enough to provide continuous intelligence flow. Axilenko never retrieved packages on the same day they were delivered. Sometimes he waited 48 hours, sometimes he waited 96 hours. The unpredictability made Federal Bureau of Investigation surveillance almost impossible. Even if investigators somehow identified the dead drop location, they would need to maintain 24-hour coverage for weeks. This would be necessary to catch a retrieval in progress. However, the Federal Bureau of Investigation did not know about the dead drop. They had no reason to suspect Miller. There was no indication that anything unusual was happening. By October 1985, Miller had provided intelligence on 7 different satellite programs. These included 3 keyhole reconnaissance satellites and 2 Magnum Signals intelligence satellites. He also compromised 1 jump seat satellite, which intercepted Soviet communications. The Mercury satellite, designed to detect ballistic missile launches, was also revealed. The cumulative value of this intelligence exceeded anything the KGB had obtained since their atomic espionage operations in the 1940s. Soviet military planners could now predict the exact timing of American satellite passes. This enabled them to conceal mobile missile launches during vulnerable windows. Soviet communications officers could avoid frequencies that signals intelligence satellites monitored. Furthermore, Soviet air defense commanders understood the infrared signatures their installations produced. This knowledge allowed them to develop masking techniques that degraded the effectiveness of satellite sensors. The CIA remained unaware of the breach. Security focused on physical document control. This involved ensuring classified materials stayed in authorized facilities. Access was properly logged, and nothing disappeared from safes or file rooms. However, the CIA was not prepared for someone who simply memorized information. Miller reconstructed this information from memory hours later. He never photographed documents, he never smuggled papers out of headquarters, he never used classified computer systems in suspicious ways. Instead, he just read and remembered what he learned. He wrote it down in his black notebook. He used a cipher that was so simple it looked like mathematical equations. The cipher itself was elegant. Each number represented a letter based on a substitution key that changed daily. This key was determined by the current date and a memorized algorithm. To anyone glancing at his notebook, the entries looked like physics calculations or computer programming notes. This was exactly what one would expect from a Stanford graduate working on technical analysis. Only someone who knew the algorithm could decode the entries. Miller had memorized it so thoroughly. He could encode and decode information in real time without conscious effort. His relationship with Axilenko remained entirely impersonal. They never met. They never spoke. They never exchanged communications except through the dead drop system. Miller received payments through a separate dead drop. This involved cash in unmarked bills. Usually he received $5,000 per delivery. The money was deposited in a different location in Rock Creek Park. He retrieved it on an independent schedule. The money accumulated in a safe deposit box at a bank in Alexandria. He used a false name with identification documents the KGB had provided. Miller never spent it. He never deposited it in his regular accounts. He never did anything that might trigger financial scrutiny. The money was proof of value, but not his motivation. What drove him was the secret knowledge that he was winning. He was defeating the very system designed to catch people like him. His father visited CIA headquarters in November 1985. He was officially there to brief analysts on FBI counterintelligence operations. These operations were against Soviet intelligence officers in Washington. Miller attended the briefing. He sat in the third row of the conference room. James Miller Sr. described KGB surveillance, detection techniques. He also covered dead drop protocols and recruitment methodologies. The irony was so perfect it made Miller want to laugh. His father was explaining the exact methods Miller used and warning CIA personnel about the precise threat Miller represented. All the while, Miller sat 30 feet away taking notes. Afterward, they had lunch in the CIA cafeteria. Father and son discussed the importance of vigilance against Soviet espionage. The elder Miller mentioned that the FBI was concerned about possible penetrations of intelligence agencies. He said the Soviets were always probing for weaknesses and believed they had to assume unidentified sources were active. Miller nodded seriously, agreeing that constant vigilance was essential. That evening, Miller made a delivery containing complete specifications for the new KH-12 satellite program. This program would not launch until 1987. However, it was already in advanced development. The specifications included resolution capabilities that exceeded anything previously deployed. Its cameras could identify objects smaller than 6 inches from orbital altitude. Infrared sensors were capable of detecting vehicle exhaust from space. Radar systems could penetrate cloud cover and see through camouflage. The KH-12 represented a $2.8 billion investment. This maintained American intelligence superiority. Soviet military planners would now have 2 years to develop countermeasures. This was before the satellite became operational. In Moscow, senior KGB officials debated how aggressively to exploit their new source. Conservative voices argued for restraint. They suggested using the information strategically. However, they warned against acting so obviously that Americans would realize they had been compromised. Aggressive voices wanted immediate operational changes. They proposed modifying Soviet military deployments based on satellite coverage schedules. They also suggested jamming satellite communications at critical frequencies. Some even considered attempting physical sabotage of satellites during launch preparations. The debate reflected a fundamental tension in intelligence work. Information is valuable only if you use it. However, using it risks revealing your source. The decision was made in December 1985. This happened at a meeting of the first Chief Directorate's leadership. They would exploit the information carefully. They would implement changes that could plausibly result from Soviet technical research rather than espionage. They would continue collecting intelligence from Miller. They aimed to expand his access if possible. However, they would avoid any action that might trigger an American mole hunt. The source was too valuable to risk through impatience. Miller's performance reviews were exceptional. Patricia Hammond wrote that he demonstrated analytical sophistication far beyond his experience level. She recommended him for promotion to senior analyst status. This would grant him access to even more sensitive programs. The promotion came through in February 1986, 8 months after he had started. With it came new clearances. This included access to compartmented programs that existed above his previous level. These projects were so sensitive they did not appear in regular CIA records. These programs represented the bleeding edge of American technical intelligence. They involved experimental satellites with capabilities that would not be operational for years. Next-generation sensor technologies and communication systems were designed to be impervious to jamming. Miller's black notebook grew thicker. He started carrying a second notebook, identical to the first. This accommodated the expanding volume of information he was encoding. The dead drops continued on their 17-day cycle. These now contained intelligence so sensitive that fewer than 200 people in the entire intelligence community had access to it. Still, nobody suspected him. His father called regularly, proud of his son's rapid advancement. His co-workers invited him to happy hours. He would drink beer and complain about bureaucracy like everyone else. His supervisors praised his work ethic and analytical skills. He was the model CIA analyst. He was exactly the kind of person the agency wanted to recruit and retain. The only person who noticed anything unusual was a woman named Sarah Kellerman. She was a communications security specialist who worked 3 cubicles away. She had observed Miller in the break room one afternoon. He was writing in his black notebook while waiting for coffee to brew. The way he wrote struck her as odd. It was rapid and mechanical. He seemed to be transcribing something rather than taking notes or working through a problem. She did not report this observation. It was not suspicious enough to justify a security referral. Instead, it was just an odd detail she filed away. This was the kind of thing one remembers later when everything else makes sense. The turning point came not from brilliant counterintelligence work, but from a mistake so simple it seemed impossible. On April 3, 1986, at 10:23 in the morning, Miller arrived at the office. He carried both notebooks. One he had been using was now almost completely filled. He had just purchased a fresh one at a bookstore near his apartment. He placed them both on his desk while he went through his morning routine. This included checking his secure computer terminal for new assignments. He also reviewed the daily intelligence briefings and made coffee. The old notebook was in his briefcase. The new notebook sat on his desk. At 11:47 in the morning, Patricia Hammond stopped by his cubicle with a rush assignment. A signals intelligence satellite had detected unusual Soviet communications patterns. These suggested a new mobile missile system. She needed Miller to review the technical specifications. This was to determine if the KH-11 satellites could provide photographic confirmation. She handed him a folder marked Top Secret, TK Umbra. This represented the highest classification for signals intelligence material. Miller opened the folder and began reading. Sarah Kellerman walked past his cubicle at 11:52 in the morning. She was heading to the printer. She glanced at Miller's desk as she passed. The new black notebook was lying open. She could see writing on the exposed page. It was not English, but a series of numbers and mathematical symbols. This looked like the notes she had seen him taking before. But something was different. The page heading read KH-11 communications frequencies in small, clear letters. It was not encoded, just abbreviated. Kellerman kept walking, but the observation lodged in her mind. Why would Miller be writing frequency information in a personal notebook? Technical analysts did not take notes like that. They either worked directly in classified systems or used approved secure notepads. These notepads got locked in safes at the end of each day. She almost dismissed it. Miller had sterling credentials and exceptional performance reviews. Maybe he was just eccentric about note-taking. But the detail nagged at her. Kellerman had worked in communications security for 9 years. She had been trained to notice anomalies and patterns that did not fit normal behavior. Over lunch, she mentioned the observation casually to a colleague from the security office. She framed it as a question about approved note-taking procedures. This was rather than a suspicion about Miller specifically. The security officer's name was Denis Kowalski. He was a former Army counterintelligence specialist. He had joined the CIA security office in 1982. He had the temperament for security work. He was patient, methodical, and suspicious by nature, but not paranoid. Kellerman's observations struck him as worth exploring. It did not prove anything. However, it suggested a deviation from standard procedure. He made a note to review Miller's file and security logs. This was to check for any other anomalies. What Kowalski found was simultaneously reassuring and puzzling. Miller's file was impeccable. His background investigation had been thorough. His performance reviews were outstanding. His father was a senior FBI counterintelligence agent. However, there was one small detail that did not quite align. Miller's rate of professional advancement seemed unusually rapid. This was true even for someone with his credentials. It took him 8 months to become a senior analyst. He gained access to compartmented programs that typically required years of experience. This was not necessarily suspicious, as talented people advanced quickly. However, combined with Kellerman's observation about the notebook, it suggested a pattern. This pattern was worth investigating. Kowalski did something subtle. Instead of launching a formal investigation, which would have triggered notifications and procedural requirements, he requested a routine audit. This audit was for Miller's safe and work area. It was the kind of random security check that happened regularly across the agency. The audit was scheduled for April 10, 1986. This was 7 days after Kellerman's observation. Miller received no advance warning, it was just his turn in the rotation. On April 9th, Miller made his scheduled dead drop delivery. The package contained specifications for the new Mercury 2 satellite. This satellite was designed to provide continuous global coverage of ballistic missile launches. It was one of his most valuable deliveries yet. This information could help the Soviet Union defeat the United States' early warning systems for nuclear attack. He followed his usual protocol. This involved an evening jog in Great Falls Park. There he paused for 8 seconds at the drainage culvert. He deposited the package and completed his run. Back at his apartment, he encoded another 12 pages of notes in his black notebook. He worked until midnight and then slept soundly. The security audit began at 9 in the morning on April 10th. Kowalski arrived with 2 other security officers. He showed Miller the authorization and explained it was a routine check. Miller seemed unfazed. He opened his safe, showed them his workspace, and answered questions about his document handling procedures. Everything appeared completely normal. His safe contained exactly the materials he was authorized to access. His computer terminal showed no unauthorized usage. His desk was organized, professional, and unremarkable. Then Kowalski asked to see the black notebook. Miller's face did not change. His breathing stayed steady. His hands remained relaxed. However, something shifted behind his eyes. A calculation happened faster than conscious thought. He had three choices. He could refuse, which would guarantee deeper investigation. He could comply and hope the cipher was not recognized. Or he could run. He reached for the notebook and handed it to Kowalski. The security officer flipped through the pages. He saw column after column of numbers and symbols. He paused on a page dated 2 days earlier. This was the page Sarah Kellerman had glimpsed. The heading, Keyhole 11 Communication Frequencies, was still visible. It was not encoded like the rest of the entry. Kowalski looked at Miller and asked what this was. Miller's response was perfect. He appeared calm, slightly confused, and completely reasonable. He stated that these were personal notes on technical concepts he was studying. He added that he liked to work through cryptographic problems as a hobby and that these were just practice exercises. Kowalski nodded slowly. He stated that the header said Keyhole 11 Communication Frequencies. He added that this was classified information. Miller explained that the header was just a label for the type of problem he was working on. He claimed the numbers below it were not real frequencies. Instead, they were hypothetical values he was using to test different encryption approaches. He offered to show the mathematics, calling it just applied number theory. It was a good answer. It was plausible and difficult to disprove immediately. Kowalski photographed 3 pages of the notebook. He told Miller that he would need to have the entries reviewed by technical security specialists. This would verify they did not contain classified information. It was a reasonable precaution. Miller agreed without objection. The audit concluded at 10:47 in the morning. Kowalski then left with photographs of 3 pages. These pages contained complete specifications for satellite communication systems, orbital parameters, and sensor capabilities. All of this information was encoded within apparently random numbers. The photographs reached the Central Intelligence Agency's Technical Security Division at 2:15 in the afternoon. An analyst named Robert Tarrington began reviewing them at 3:30 in the afternoon. Tarrington had a Doctor of Philosophy degree in mathematics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He had spent 6 years analyzing cryptographic systems. He looked at Miller's notes and immediately recognized they were not random. The number distributions were wrong, there were too many repetitions of certain values and too few of others. It was not strong encryption, but it was definitely encoding. Someone had embedded information within what appeared to be mathematical exercises. Tarrington worked through the night, applying different decryption approaches. He tried simple substitution ciphers, polyalphabetic ciphers, book codes, and mathematical transformations. Nothing worked. The numbers resisted interpretation. However, the statistical patterns convinced him the encoding was real. At 6:45 in the morning on April 11th, he wrote a memo recommending a full counterintelligence investigation of James Miller Jr. The memo reached the Central Intelligence Agency Office of Security at 8:30 in the morning. The investigation began at 10 in the morning. Miller knew something was wrong the moment he arrived at work. He found Patricia Hammond absent from her office. She was always there before him. It was one of her quirks to arrive at 7 in the morning to review overnight intelligence reports before the rest of the staff came in. Her absence meant either illness or something unusual was happening. When Dennis Kowalski appeared at Miller's cubicle at 10:15 in the morning, he asked Miller to come to the security office for follow-up questions about the notebook. Miller then understood that the investigation had accelerated beyond routine procedure. The interview room was small and windowless. It was designed for exactly this purpose. 2 security officers were present, Kowalski and a woman Miller did not recognize. They asked him to explain his note-taking methodology in detail. They questioned what mathematical problems he was working on and where the numbers came from. Could he demonstrate the process with examples? Miller remained calm and cooperative. He explained his hobby of cryptographic analysis and offered to show his work step by step. However, he made a critical error. When asked to decode one of his entries on the spot, he hesitated for 3 seconds too long. A genuine hobby would involve methods you could demonstrate immediately. The hesitation suggested he was trying to remember a process rather than apply a familiar technique. Kowalski noticed it. The woman, who introduced herself as Margaret Chen from Counterintelligence Division, also noticed it. They pressed harder. They demanded that he show exactly how he derived these numbers. They asked him to explain why he chose these particular values. They also questioned why he labeled this entry with a classified program name if the content was hypothetical. Miller's responses became less convincing. He contradicted himself about the source of certain values. He claimed mathematical relationships that did not actually exist. The interview lasted 4 hours. By 2:30 in the afternoon, Chen told him he was suspended from his position. This was pending completion of the security investigation. He would surrender his badge, his access credentials, and his notebooks. He would not return to his workspace. Security officers would escort him from the building immediately. Miller did not protest. He signed the necessary paperwork and handed over his badge. He then walked out of Central Intelligence Agency headquarters at 3:17 in the afternoon. 2 security officers escorted him. They watched him drive away in his Honda Civic. He knew the Federal Bureau of Investigation would be on him within hours. The Central Intelligence Agency would brief them immediately about a suspected compromise. Surveillance teams would be deployed to watch his apartment, his car, and his movements. They would obtain a warrant for his safe deposit box, his financial records, and his telephone logs. The investigation would be comprehensive and sophisticated, making it impossible to evade. He had one decision to make: to run or to stay. At 5:45 in the afternoon, Miller drove to the bank in Alexandria. He kept his safe deposit box there. He withdrew $127,000 in cash. These were the accumulated payments from 18 months of espionage. He drove to his apartment and packed a suitcase with clothes and documents. He made one phone call to a number he had memorized but never dialed before. This was the emergency contact Axi Len-ko had given him during their only face-to-face meeting. This meeting happened at Stanford before the recruitment was finalized. The phone rang 7 times. Someone answered but said nothing. Miller spoke the code phrase about the Columbia bookstore losing his order. The response was immediate. He was told replacement copies would arrive Tuesday at the Arlington branch. This meant Miller had 37 hours before extraction would be ready. The Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at Miller's apartment at 8:23 in the evening. They knocked, identified themselves, and announced they had a warrant to search the premises. Miller did not answer. He was 90 minutes away by then, driving south on Interstate 95 toward Richmond. The $127,000 were in his suitcase. His 2 black notebooks were on the passenger seat. He had made his decision. Running meant admission of guilt. Staying, however, meant certain arrest and conviction. The evidence in his notebooks was damning, even though most of it was encoded. Investigators would eventually break the cipher, or he would break under interrogation. Either way, the result was life in prison. What he did not know was that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had already broken the cipher. While Tarrington worked on the photographs of 3 pages, another analyst had accessed Miller's work computer. This analyst found temporary files Miller had thought were deleted. These were draft notes he had made before encoding them in his notebook. The temporary files contained plain text references to classified programs. These were alongside the same numerical strings that appeared in the notebook. It took only 6 hours to derive the cipher key. By the time the Federal Bureau of Investigation arrived at Miller's apartment, they had decoded 43 pages of his notebooks. They recovered specifications for 17 different satellite programs. They also found communication frequencies, orbital parameters, and sensor capabilities. The damage assessment was staggering. Miller had compromised virtually every technical intelligence collection system the United States operated in space. The manhunt began at 8:47 in the evening on April 11th, 1986. Federal Bureau of Investigation field offices from Washington to Florida were notified. State and local police received bulletins. The Central Intelligence Agency contacted the State Department, which issued alerts to border crossings and airports. Miller's photograph was distributed to every law enforcement agency on the East Coast. However, the Federal Bureau of Investigation made one critical assumption. They focused on airports and border crossings. They expected Miller to flee the country through conventional exit points. They did not anticipate the extraction plan Axi Len-ko had activated. The Soviet extraction plan did not involve airports or borders. Instead, it involved a fishing boat. The vessel was a 48-foot commercial fishing trawler named Maria Volnova. It was registered in Bermuda but owned through a shell company by the Soviet Union. It operated legitimately most of the time. It caught tuna and swordfish in the Atlantic. However, it also maintained an encrypted radio and a global positioning system navigation system. This system was far more sophisticated than any fishing boat needed. 3 times per year, it received orders to position itself at specific coordinates off the Virginia coast. It would then wait for signals. On April 12, 1986, at 2:34 in the morning, the Maria Volnova was 19 nautical miles east of Virginia Beach. This was well outside United States' territorial waters. The captain, a Ukrainian named Oleg Petrov, had worked Komitet Gosudastvenoi Bezopasnosti maritime operations for 14 years. He received an encrypted radio message. The message instructed him to prepare extraction for one package at Virginia Beach Pier on Sunday evening. Petrov acknowledged the message and began making preparations. The pickup would happen in 36 hours. Miller spent April 12th in a motel outside Norfolk. He paid cash and used a false name. He avoided any contact that might create a record of his presence. His photograph was on television news by Saturday afternoon. The news reported that a Central Intelligence Agency analyst was suspected of espionage and considered armed and dangerous. The coverage included interviews with shocked co-workers. There were also statements from Central Intelligence Agency officials about the ongoing investigation. It included speculation about what secrets might have been compromised. Miller watched from his motel room. He ate takeout food and reviewed his notebooks one final time. He had memorized everything important. He wanted the physical notebooks intact when he reached Moscow. They represented proof of what he had accomplished. This also served as insurance against any Soviet suspicion that he was actually a Central Intelligence Agency plant sent to feed them disinformation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had tracked Miller's credit card to a gas station in Richmond on April 11th. This established his direction of travel. Agents interviewed everyone at his apartment complex. They learned that he had left in a hurry, carrying luggage. The Bureau obtained his bank records and discovered the safe deposit box withdrawal. The withdrawal of $127,000 confirmed he was a paid source. He was not an ideologue. The Bureau's Norfolk field office deployed agents to watch airports, marinas, and any location Miller might use to flee. However, with thousands of square miles of coastline and hundreds of potential departure points, agents could not cover everything. Axel & Co. made his own run south. He drove separately from Miller, but with the same destination. He had received orders from Moscow to exfiltrate with Miller. The Americans would certainly identify Axel & Co. as Miller's handler. This would happen once they decoded the notebooks and analyzed dead drop locations. Axel & Co.'s diplomatic immunity would protect him legally. However, the Central Intelligence Agency would expel him. His intelligence career would end and he would return to Moscow. He would have lost his post in the productive Washington station. It was better to orchestrate Miller's escape and return alongside him as a hero. The pickup was scheduled for 9:30 post-meridium on April 13th. It was to take place at the end of a commercial fishing pier in Virginia Beach. Miller arrived first at 9:17 post-meridium. He parked in the public lot and walked onto the pier carrying his suitcase. The pier extended 200 yards into the Atlantic. Evenly spaced lights illuminated it, creating pools of brightness separated by darkness. Several fishermen were scattered along its length. They cast lines into the black water. Miller walked to the end and waited. The Maria Volnova appeared at 9:28 post-meridium. Its running lights were visible a half-mile offshore. The vessel approached the pier at 4 knots. To anyone watching, it looked like a fishing boat. It appeared to be heading back to port after an evening of offshore fishing. Miller saw a Zodiac inflatable boat being lowered from the trawler's stern. 2 men climbed down into the boat. The Zodiac's motor started with a quiet purr. The small craft began moving toward the pier. At 9:31 post-meridium, a Virginia Beach police officer named Michael Santos was patrolling the ocean front. He received a radio call about a suspicious person at the fishing pier. The caller described a man matching James Miller's description, carrying a suitcase and standing alone at the end of the pier. Santos radioed for backup and drove toward the pier entrance. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had briefed all local law enforcement about Miller. Santos knew that he was potentially armed and desperate. Miller saw the police car's headlights in the parking lot. He immediately understood what was happening. The Zodiac was still 200 yards away. It was approaching in darkness. The police car was accelerating toward the pier entrance. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the officer reached his position. The decision was instant and instinctive. Miller ran. He sprinted along the pier toward the shore. His suitcase banged against his leg. Officer Santos was running from the opposite direction. His flashlight beam stabbed through the darkness. Santos shouted commands, telling Miller to stop and get on the ground. Miller did not stop. Miller reached a section of the pier where a maintenance ladder descended to the water. The ladder dropped 8 feet down to the surf, breaking against the pilings. He did not hesitate. He dropped the suitcase over the side. He heard it splash and climbed over the railing. The fall into cold Atlantic water in April was shocking. The temperature was 54 degrees. This was cold enough to induce hypothermia within 30 minutes. Miller surfaced gasping. He was disoriented by the darkness and cold. His suitcase was floating 6 feet away. It was buoyant enough to stay on the surface. Miller grabbed the suitcase and began swimming toward deeper water. He swam away from the pier and toward where he had last seen the Zodiac approaching. Officer Santos reached the railing. He shone his flashlight down at the water. He could see Miller swimming. The suitcase created a visible wake. Santos radioed for Coast Guard assistance. He continued tracking Miller's position with the flashlight. The Zodiac changed course, accelerating toward Miller's position. Its 2-person crew had watched the entire sequence. They understood what needed to happen. One of them was Arc-C Lenko. The Zodiac reached Miller at 9:36 post-meridium. Strong hands grabbed his arms. They hauled him over the inflatable's rubber side and dragged the suitcase aboard. The outboard motor accelerated to full power. The Zodiac raced back toward the Maria Volnova, which was now 300 yards offshore. Officer Santos watched from the pier. His flashlight beam was too weak to illuminate anything at that distance. He radioed the Coast Guard again, providing the trawler's position and description. However, the closest Coast Guard vessel was 22 minutes away. The Maria Volnova was outside United States territorial waters by 9:41 post-meridium. The Zodiac was secured aboard. Miller was below deck, wrapped in blankets. He shivered violently, but remained conscious. Arc-C Lenko sat beside him, speaking Russian. He told Miller that he was safe now. Arc-C Lenko added that they were heading to international waters. By tomorrow night, Miller would be in Cuba. By next week, he would be in Moscow. Miller did not respond. Miller was experiencing the physiological effects of cold water immersion. This combined with an adrenaline crash. However, Miller was alive and free. He had escaped. The Federal Bureau of Investigation coordinated with the Coast Guard to intercept the Maria Volnova. However, maritime law complicated their pursuit. The trawler was in international waters. It was flagged to Bermuda and engaged in what appeared to be legitimate fishing operations. Boarding the vessel would require either permission or evidence of criminal activity occurring on it. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had neither. Agents watched on radar as the trawler continued east. It increased speed to 12 knots, heading toward the open Atlantic. By midnight, the trawler was beyond any realistic intercept range. The escape dominated news coverage for 3 days. A Central Intelligence Agency analyst fled a Federal Bureau of Investigation manhunt. He was extracted by a Soviet vessel off the Virginia coast. The story confirmed Americans' worst fears about intelligence penetrations. Congressional committees demanded briefings. The Central Intelligence Agency director faced calls for resignation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was criticized for allowing Miller to evade capture. Defense Department officials began damage assessments. They tried to determine which satellite programs were compromised and how severely. Miller reached Havana on April 15, 1986. From Havana, he flew to Moscow on a Soviet military transport. He arrived on April 17th at a military airfield outside the city. KGB officers debriefed him for 6 weeks. They went through his notebooks page by page, verifying the information. They cross-referenced it with technical intelligence they had collected through other sources. Everything checked out. Miller was not a plant. He was exactly what he appeared to be. He was a brilliant analyst who had betrayed the most sensitive American intelligence programs in existence. His father, James Miller Sr., learned about his son's espionage on the television news like everyone else. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had not warned him. They were investigating whether the father had been complicit or negligent. The Bureau wanted to know if he had somehow facilitated his son's security clearance. The elder Miller insisted he had had no knowledge, no suspicion, and no indication. He maintained that his son was anything other than a loyal American pursuing a legitimate career. The Federal Bureau of Investigation eventually concluded he was telling the truth. He had been exploited. His reputation and connections had been used to provide his son with credibility. This credibility expedited the security clearance process. James Miller Sr. retired from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. 6 months later, his career was destroyed by his son's betrayal. Patricia Hammond underwent intensive security interviews. She explained in exhaustive detail how she had supervised Miller. She also explained what she had observed and whether she had missed warning signs. The consensus was that Miller had been extraordinarily skilled at maintaining his cover. He had performed brilliantly at his job. Miller exhibited no suspicious behavior and followed all security protocols except the one that mattered. He had memorized information instead of stealing it. This made detection nearly impossible until Sarah Kellerman happened to notice his notebook. Hammond transferred to a different Central Intelligence Agency division afterward. Her career was tainted by association, even though she had done nothing wrong. Sarah Kellerman received a Central Intelligence Agency Director's Award for her observation. Her casual notice of Miller's note-taking had triggered the investigation. This prevented even greater damage. If Miller had continued undetected for another year, he would have accessed even more sensitive programs. This would have happened as his security clearances expanded. The Central Intelligence Agency Security Office revised its procedures based on the Miller case. They implemented new restrictions on personal note-taking. The office also required regular audits of analysts' work habits. The revelation of Miller's espionage came in stages. Each disclosure was more damaging than the last. The Central Intelligence Agency's initial damage assessment in May 1986 concluded that Miller had compromised significant technical information about satellite collection systems. This was bureaucratic language designed to minimize public panic. Meanwhile, intelligence officials tried to understand the full scope of the breach. The truth was worse. Miller had provided the Soviet Union with complete technical specifications. This included every major reconnaissance and signals intelligence satellite system the United States operated. The value to Soviet military planners was incalculable. By June 1986, the impacts were becoming visible. American intelligence analysts noticed Soviet military units changing their operational patterns. These changes suggested detailed knowledge of satellite coverage. Mobile missile launchers that had previously operated openly now moved only during specific time windows. These windows occurred when no American satellites were overhead. Soviet communications patterns shifted to frequencies. Signals intelligence satellites monitored these frequencies least effectively. Soviet military facilities installed new camouflage systems. These systems were designed to defeat the specific sensor wavelengths the KH-11 satellites used. The Reagan administration faced a strategic dilemma. The administration could redesign the compromised satellite systems. However, that would cost billions of dollars and take years. The administration could launch new satellites on different schedules to disrupt Soviet predictions. But orbital mechanics limited how much flexibility they had. The administration could develop new encryption systems for satellite communications. However, encryption changes required replacing ground stations across the globe. Every solution was expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain. In August 1986, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence held closed hearings about the Miller case. The transcripts remained classified for 11 years. They were finally declassified in 1997 under Freedom of Information Act pressure. The transcripts revealed the extent of the disaster. One Central Intelligence Agency official testified about Miller's actions. This official stated that Miller had provided the Soviet Union with the entire satellite intelligence architecture of the United States. He explained that the Soviets now understood American capabilities, limitations, priorities, and technical methods. They could predict American collection, evade censors, and potentially deceive analysts. The intelligence advantage maintained by the United States since the 1960s had been fundamentally compromised. The most damaging testimony came from General Bernard Henderson. He was the director of the National Reconnaissance Office. This agency was responsible for building and operating America's spy satellites. General Henderson described the financial impact. He stated that the United States had spent approximately $18 billion developing the satellite systems Miller compromised. The cost to recover that advantage would exceed $25 billion over the next decade. This would involve redesigning systems, launching replacements, and developing new technologies that the Soviets could not counter. Henderson called this the most expensive intelligence failure in American history, measured purely in dollar terms. The strategic cost, he added, was harder to quantify, but potentially catastrophic. The Federal Bureau of Investigation continued its investigation even though Miller had escaped. They needed to understand how the breach happened and how long it lasted. They also needed to know if other sources might be operating with similar methods. The investigation recovered Miller's encoded notebooks from his apartment. He had left several completed notebooks behind in his rush to escape. Federal Bureau of Investigation cryptanalysts worked with Central Intelligence Agency technical specialists to decode them completely. The notebooks covered 18 months of espionage, from July 1985 to April 1986. They documented the systematic theft of information about 17 different satellite programs. Dozens of related technical systems were also compromised. One notebook entry from October 1985 was particularly revealing. Miller had written in encoded form his views on security. He believed that security was not about physical locks and safes, but rather about trust. He noted that he was trusted because he was the son of a patriot. Furthermore, he was seen as brilliant and loyal. Miller believed this trust gave him access to everything. He observed that the more he proved himself, the more access he received. He also noted that the system was designed to protect against outsiders, not insiders. Miller considered himself the perfect insider. The arrogance in that entry captured Miller's psychology. He did not see himself as a traitor. Instead, he saw himself as someone who had identified a fundamental weakness in American security culture. He believed he had exploited this weakness brilliantly. The espionage was proof of his superiority. It was evidence that he was smarter than the entire intelligence establishment. Money was secondary to him. Recognition was impossible. Nobody could know what he had accomplished unless he was caught. What mattered was the private knowledge that he had won a game most people did not know they were playing. Dennis Kowalski, the security officer who first investigated Miller's notebooks, testified before Congress in September 1986. His testimony focused on how close the Central Intelligence Agency had come to missing the breach entirely. Kowalski stated that Miller would still be operating if Sarah Kellerman had not noticed the notebook. He added that Miller would also still be operating if he himself had not decided to do a routine audit. Furthermore, if Robert Tarrington had not recognized the encoding, Miller would have continued advancing through the system. This would have given him access to even more sensitive programs. Kowalski concluded that they caught Miller partly through good security work, but mostly through luck. He believed this fact should terrify everyone. The CIA implemented sweeping security reforms in response to the Miller case. These reforms included new restrictions on personal note-taking. Mandatory random audits of analysts' workspaces were also implemented. Furthermore, enhanced scrutiny was applied to employees with rapid advancement patterns. Psychological profiling identified personality traits associated with espionage risk. None of these reforms could undo the damage Miller caused, but they might prevent the next Miller. James Miller Jr. appeared on Soviet television in September 1986. This was his first public statement since the defection. The interview was carefully orchestrated propaganda. It was designed to embarrass the United States and justify Soviet intelligence operations. Miller described his disillusionment with American intelligence work. He believed the Cold War was perpetuated by secrecy and mistrust. He was convinced that sharing information would make both sides more secure. He claimed he had acted from conscience, not for money. The $127,000 in payments was not mentioned. American intelligence analysts watched the interview. They analyzed Miller's demeanor and statements for insights into his psychology and Soviet debriefing. The consensus was that Miller seemed uncomfortable, reading from prepared statements rather than speaking naturally. The Soviets were using him as a propaganda asset. However, his value to them was the information he had provided, not his public relations capabilities. After the September 1986 interview, Miller disappeared from public view. He had served his propaganda purpose and was not needed anymore. The Federal Bureau of Investigation learned from Soviet State Security Committee defectors years later that Miller spent the remainder of his life in Moscow. He worked as a technical consultant for Soviet intelligence agencies. He received a comfortable salary, a nice apartment, and the recognition he had always craved from the Soviet State Security Committee. However, he did not receive it from the Central Intelligence Agency. Furthermore, he was also a prisoner of sorts. He was unable to travel freely. He remained under constant KGB supervision to ensure he did not become disillusioned. This also ensured he did not attempt to return to the United States. The intelligence services that celebrated him also never fully trusted him. He had betrayed one country. They questioned what would prevent him from betraying another country. In 1991, after the Soviet Union collapsed, the Central Intelligence Agency made inquiries. They asked whether Miller might be willing to return to face prosecution. The Russian intelligence services, successor to the KGB, indicated Miller had no interest in returning. He remained in Moscow, his fate unknown to American authorities. Some reports suggested he died in the mid-1990s. Others claimed he was still alive in the 2000s, living in obscurity under a different name. The Central Intelligence Agency never confirmed his status. He had vanished into the same secrecy he had once exploited. The human cost of Miller's betrayal extended beyond statistics and budget figures. American intelligence officers, whose identities might have been compromised by satellite intelligence methods, had to be withdrawn from operations. Agents in the Soviet Union who had been recruited based on information gathered by compromised satellites faced increased risk of exposure. While no direct casualties were attributed to Miller's espionage, the strategic damage weakened American intelligence capabilities at a critical moment in the Cold War. The satellite programs Miller compromised were eventually redesigned and replaced. The process took 8 years. It cost exactly what General Henderson predicted, over $25 billion. The new systems incorporated encryption that was mathematically impossible to break without quantum computers that did not exist yet. They operated on different orbital parameters that made prediction more difficult. They used sensor technologies the Soviets could not counter with 1980s electronics. By 1994, American satellite intelligence had recovered its technological advantage. However, the 8-year gap represented a period of vulnerability. Soviet military planners exploited this vulnerability in conflicts from Afghanistan to Eastern Europe. One document declassified in 2003 was a National Security Council memorandum from June 1986. This memorandum captured the administration's perspective on the Miller case. It stated that the compromise of satellite intelligence systems represented a strategic setback. This setback was comparable to the loss of atomic secrets in the 1940s. The memorandum noted that America's technical intelligence advantage had been the foundation of deterrence strategy since the early Cold War. That advantage was now severely degraded. The adversary's confidence in their ability to operate without observation had increased accordingly. This increased the risk of miscalculation and potentially catastrophic conflict. In 2019, a journalist named Alexandra Morris received an unexpected email. The sender identified himself as someone with information about the James Miller espionage case. He was willing to share details that had never been made public. Morris was skeptical. Cold War spy stories often attracted conspiracy theorists and attention seekers. However, something about the email's specificity made her continue the conversation. The source claimed to have been a junior KGB officer in 1986. He was involved in the debriefing of Miller after his extraction to Moscow. Over the course of 6 months, Morris verified details the source provided against declassified documents and historical records. Everything checked out. The source knew information that had not been publicly released. This included details about Miller's notebooks and the damage assessments. Only someone with direct access could have known these details. Morris eventually met the source in a cafe in Vienna. The source was a retired Russian intelligence officer named Dmitry Vohl. He was living in Austria on a modest pension. Vohl was willing to talk because he believed the historical record should be complete. Dmitry Vohl described Miller's arrival in Moscow in April 1986. Miller expected to be treated as a hero, and initially he was. The senior officers who debriefed him were impressed by what he had accomplished. However, as the debriefing continued, they began to see his true character. He was not an ideological convert to socialism. He was also not someone motivated by conscience. Instead, he was just an arrogant young man who thought he was smarter than everyone else. The KGB respected his intelligence, but they never trusted him. VOHL Kofar questioned how they could trust him. Miller had betrayed his country for money and ego. VOHL Kof wondered what kind of person would do that. DME Tree. VOHL Kof also revealed something that had not appeared in any American intelligence assessments. Miller had become depressed within a year of arriving in Moscow. The reality of defection wore on him in ways he had not anticipated. This included permanent separation from family and friends. It also meant separation from the culture he had grown up in. The KGB provided comfortable living conditions, but could not provide meaning or purpose. Miller's work as a technical consultant was useful, but not fulfilling. He had traded everything for a secret victory. Only a handful of KGB officers appreciated this victory. The victory felt increasingly hollow. DME Tree Vochelkov said that Miller told one of the debriefing officers he had made a mistake. This mistake was not betraying the United States, as he did not regret that. His mistake was running. If he had stayed and faced prosecution, at least the Americans would have understood what he had accomplished. His trial would have revealed the scope of his espionage. Historians would have written about him. Instead, he was invisible. He was living in comfortable obscurity but complete isolation. The recognition he wanted did not exist because nobody knew the full story. DME Trevolkov's revelations prompted the Central Intelligence Agency to declassify additional documents about the Miller case. This included damage assessments that had remained classified for 33 years. These documents confirmed what intelligence officials had suspected but never publicly stated. Miller's espionage had been even more damaging than the original assessment suggested. He had compromised not just operational satellite systems, but also research programs that would not become operational for years. The Soviet Union knew about American satellite technologies before they were deployed. This allowed them to develop countermeasures. These countermeasures remained effective throughout the 1990s. One particularly significant document was a 1987 Central Intelligence Agency memo. It was titled Long-Term Strategic Impact of Miller Compromise. The memo argued that Miller's espionage had fundamentally altered the Cold War intelligence balance. It stated that for the first time since the U-2 program began in 1956, the Soviet Union possessed detailed knowledge of American overhead reconnaissance capabilities. This knowledge allowed them to operate with confidence. They understood American intelligence collection methods. The psychological advantage America maintained, which made Soviet military planners constantly wonder what could be seen, had been lost. The memo concluded that they now knew what America could see. They could therefore plan accordingly. The memo went on to recommend a complete restructuring of American technical intelligence. It suggested moving away from predictable satellite systems. The goal was to adopt more flexible platforms that were harder to track and counter. This recommendation eventually led to the development of steerable satellites. It also led to hypersonic reconnaissance drones. These and other systems defined late Cold War intelligence collection. Miller's betrayal, in a perverse way, forced the American intelligence community to innovate beyond the satellite architecture they had relied on for decades. Sarah Kellerman, the communications security specialist, left the Central Intelligence Agency in 1989. Her observation triggered the investigation. She moved to the private sector, working in cybersecurity. Eventually, she became a consultant for companies developing secure communication systems. In a 2015 interview, she reflected on the Miller case. Kellerman learned that security was not about technology or procedures. Instead, it was about people. Miller defeated their security because he understood people. He knew how they thought, what they trusted, and how they made decisions about risk. The technical aspects of his espionage were almost trivial. The sophisticated part involved his social engineering. He manipulated the trust people placed in him. This was the part they still had not solved. Patricia Hammond remained at the Central Intelligence Agency. She eventually rose to senior management positions in the Satellite Intelligence Division. She never supervised analysts directly again. However, her experience with Miller shaped her approach to security culture. She advocated for what she called healthy paranoia. This was a management philosophy that assumed every analyst was potentially compromised. It designed systems accordingly. In some ways, this approach was exhausting and dehumanizing. However, it was also realistic. The Miller case proved that background checks and security clearances were not sufficient. The agency needed constant vigilance and continuous monitoring. It also needed to recognize that trust was a vulnerability as much as a necessity. Dennis Kowalski, the security officer, conducted the audit that exposed Miller. He received no public recognition for his work. Security officers rarely received public recognition. Their successes were classified. Their failures were public relations disasters. Kowalski continued at the Central Intelligence Agency for another 12 years. He eventually retired in 1998. In a classified post-operation report about the Miller investigation, Kowalski wrote that their security model assumed people wanted to protect secrets. Miller did not. Instead, he wanted to steal them. He spent months preparing to do exactly that, even before he applied for a Central Intelligence Agency position. Kowalski noted that their background investigations looked backward at what people had done. He argued they needed to look forward at what candidates might do. This required different methods and different questions. It also required a willingness to reject qualified candidates based on psychological assessments. This approach was different from merely checking boxes on a clearance form. The broader intelligence community implemented some of Kowalski's recommendations. However, the fundamental tension remained. Intelligence work required recruiting brilliant people. It also meant giving them access to sensitive information. Agencies then had to trust them to use that information appropriately. The system could not function without trust. However, trust created vulnerability. Miller exploited that vulnerability perfectly. There was no obvious solution except accepting that occasional betrayals were inevitable. Agencies then had to try to minimize the damage when they occurred. The Black Notebook now sits in an evidence locker at Federal Bureau of Investigation headquarters in Washington. It is catalogued as evidence in a case that will never go to trial. The notebook contains 63 pages of encoded information. This information is now fully decrypted. It documents the preparation for espionage that began long before Miller set foot in Central Intelligence Agency headquarters. The final entry was dated July 11, 1985. This was one day before Miller's first day at the agency. Miller noted that everything would change the next day. He would be inside the system he had been studying from outside. All the preparation, planning, and analysis would either work or it would not. However, he knew it would work. He believed he understood them better than they understood themselves. That was his advantage. That entry captured something profound about intelligence failure. Miller did not defeat the Central Intelligence Agency's security through technical sophistication. He defeated it through understanding. This included understanding how the system worked and how decisions were made. It also meant knowing what assumptions people operated under and where the blind spots were. He had grown up inside the intelligence community's culture. He watched his father navigate it for 23 years. He knew what behavior seemed normal and what raised suspicion. He also knew how to project loyalty while planning betrayal. The Central Intelligence Agency's security system was designed to catch outsiders trying to penetrate inward. It was not designed to catch insiders who already understood the system's logic. In the years after the Cold War ended, declassified Soviet documents revealed how the KGB had assessed Miller's value. One assessment from August 1986 described him as the most productive American source since Venona. This referred to the Soviet atomic espionage networks of the 1940s. Another assessment calculated the monetary value of the intelligence Miller provided. It was approximately $2.3 billion. This was based on the cost the United States would incur replacing compromised systems. The KGB's investment in Miller was $127,000 in payments. This represented a return of 18,000%. No intelligence operation in history had generated that kind of return on investment. However, the Soviet documents also revealed something else. They showed guilt about how they had used Miller. This was not moral guilt about espionage. The KGB did not suffer from that. Instead, it was operational guilt about burning through such a valuable source so quickly. Miller had only operated for 18 months before the Central Intelligence Agency discovered him. A more patient approach might have extended his usefulness for years. This would have allowed him to access even more sensitive programs as his career advanced. The decision to activate him immediately after he received his security clearance had been aggressive. It was arguably reckless. Senior KGB officials debated whether they had made a strategic error. They considered if they were sacrificing long-term intelligence potential for short-term gains. The debate was never resolved. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. This took with it the institutional memory of the Miller operation. The Russian intelligence services that succeeded the KGB had different priorities. They also had different methods and different relationships with Western intelligence agencies. The Cold War paranoia that had driven operations like Miller's recruitment gave way to a different kind of conflict. This included corporate espionage, cyber warfare, and political manipulation. The spy satellites that Miller had compromised became obsolete as new technologies emerged. The entire landscape of intelligence collection transformed. However, the fundamental vulnerability Miller exploited remained. Intelligence agencies still needed to recruit brilliant people. They had to give them security clearances. Then they had to trust them with sensitive information. Statistically, some percentage of those people would inevitably betray that trust. The reasons for betrayal varied widely. These included money, ideology, ego, resentment, and psychological dysfunction. However, the result was always the same. Secrets flowed to adversaries, capabilities were compromised, and lives were potentially endangered. Security improvements reduced the frequency of betrayals. However, they could not eliminate them entirely. The system required trust, and trust created vulnerability. In 2008, a retired Central Intelligence Agency officer named William Drummond published a memoir. It was about his career in satellite intelligence. The memoir included a chapter about the Miller case. Drummond never mentioned Miller by name. Classification rules still protected some details. Drummond wrote that the hardest lesson of counterintelligence was that secrets could not be protected from everyone. They could only be protected from most people, most of the time. Occasionally, someone would defeat their security. When that happened, they learned from the failure and adapted. The Miller case taught them that family connections and stellar credentials did not guarantee loyalty. Such traits might actually create complacency. This led to a sense that someone so obviously qualified did not need the same scrutiny as others. Drummond concluded that this was their mistake and they paid for it. Drummond also reflected on the psychological profile of insider threats. He explained that these threats often came from the most talented people in the organization. They had to be because the intelligence they could access was proportional to their responsibilities and clearances. Mediocre analysts did not get access to the most sensitive programs. However, brilliant analysts did. Some brilliant people had personality disorders that made betrayal attractive. These included narcissism, antisocial tendencies, and a need to prove they were smarter than everyone else. He stated that agencies recruited for intelligence and competence. However, those same traits could manifest as arrogance and contempt for rules. A person brilliant enough to understand complex satellite systems might also be brilliant enough to betray them. The Miller case influenced how intelligence agencies approach security for the next 3 decades. New psychological screening protocols tried to identify personality traits associated with espionage risk. Continuous evaluation programs monitored employees' behavior throughout their careers. They looked for changes that might indicate compromise or disillusionment. Technology provided new tools. These included computer system monitoring that tracked what information analysts accessed. Data loss prevention systems detected unusual patterns of information access. Artificial intelligence-powered analytics identified anomalies in behavior. These improvements made espionage harder, but not impossible. In 2021, a former National Security Agency analyst named Joshua Schulte was convicted of stealing classified information. He provided this information about Central Intelligence Agency hacking tools to WikiLeaks. The case had eerie similarities to Miller. It involved a brilliant young analyst with rapid access to sensitive information. Psychological arrogance motivated betrayal. The theft used sophisticated methods of concealment. The 35-year gap between Miller's espionage in 1985 and Schulte's in 2017 had not eliminated the vulnerability. It had merely changed the specific information being stolen and the methods used to steal it. The fundamental question remained unanswered. How do agencies protect secrets from the people authorized to know them? The intelligence community's answer was imperfect. It involved layered security and continuous monitoring. It also included a culture that emphasized the consequences of betrayal. Furthermore, there was an acceptance that occasional failures were inevitable. However, every failure carried strategic costs, financial costs, and potentially human costs. The Miller case represented one of the most expensive failures in intelligence history. It was measured in dollars and strategic advantage. Others would follow. A small cemetery outside Moscow contains a grave marked simply James M. There is no last name, no dates, and no epitaph. According to unconfirmed reports, this is James Wolcott Miller Jr.'s final resting place. He allegedly died in 2004 of heart failure. He was 41 years old. He lived barely half his expected lifespan. The stress of defection, the isolation of exile, and the psychological burden of betrayal all took their toll. Money and KGB recognition could not compensate for these tolls. However, the grave's existence remains unconfirmed. The Russian intelligence services do not discuss former sources, even deceased ones. The Central Intelligence Agency's attempts to verify Miller's fate have been inconclusive. He might be dead. He might also be alive, living under a different identity. Perhaps he's trying to forget who he was and what he did. The uncertainty is fitting in a way. Miller spent his entire career in intelligence trying to uncover secrets. Now, he is the secret. He remains a mystery that may never be conclusively solved. The Black Notebook remains in the Federal Bureau of Investigation evidence locker. It is a physical reminder of how close the United States came to missing one of its most damaging security breaches. Sarah Kellerman happened to walk past Miller's cubicle. His notebook was visible with an unencoded header at that exact moment. If she had not seen it, he might have operated for years longer. A chain of chance events exposed him. These included Kellerman's observation, Kowalski's decision to investigate, and Tarrington's recognition of the encoding. The timing of the security audit was also crucial. This chain could easily have broken at any point. Intelligence security depends partly on procedures and technology. However, it also relies on luck. The Miller case succeeded partly through good security practices. Mostly, it succeeded through fortunate timing. The satellites Miller compromised have long since been decommissioned. They were replaced by technologies he never knew existed. The information he stole shaped Soviet military planning for 15 years. A period extending well beyond his capture. It influenced force deployments. It also affected arms control negotiations. The intelligence advantage the United States lost in 1985 took nearly a decade to recover. During that decade, the Cold War reached its final stage. It ended not with the nuclear confrontation everyone feared, but with the economic collapse of the Soviet system. The satellite intelligence Miller compromised had been designed to prevent war. It was intended to provide accurate information about Soviet capabilities. Instead, it gave the Soviets accurate information about American capabilities. This created a different kind of balance. It was a mutual understanding of vulnerabilities. This may have actually reduced, rather than increased, the risk of conflict. That possibility haunted the intelligence officials who assessed the Miller damage. Perhaps he had been right, in a twisted way that sharing information made both sides more secure. The satellite specifications he provided gave Soviet military planners confidence. They believed they understood American reconnaissance capabilities. This reduced their paranoia. Potentially, it made them less likely to take desperate actions based on uncertainty. However, that argument required accepting that espionage was good policy. It meant believing that betrayal served peace. It also suggested that the theft of billions of dollars in technology somehow made the world safer. Most intelligence officials rejected that rationalization. They believed Miller had betrayed his country for ego and money. The strategic consequences were fortunate only by accident. They were not due to his design or intention. The true cost of the Miller case may never be fully calculable. It included the $25 billion spent replacing compromised systems. The United States lost strategic advantage during 8 years of vulnerability, a significant period of strategic disadvantage. Intelligence operations were compromised by Soviet knowledge of collection methods. There was also the human cost to Miller's family, destroyed by his betrayal. An intangible cost was the eroded trust within the intelligence community. Every analyst who worked with sensitive information after 1986 operated under suspicion that had not existed before. The assumption of loyalty was gone. It was replaced by constant vigilance and monitoring. The culture of secrecy became more paranoid, more restrictive, and less trusting. That cultural shift was necessary for security. However, it was corrosive to the collaborative atmosphere that intelligence analysis required. In the end, the Miller case represented a perfect storm of vulnerabilities. A brilliant young analyst understood security systems from growing up inside the intelligence community. A Soviet intelligence agency recruitment operation identified and exploited his psychological weaknesses. The Central Intelligence Agency security system was designed to catch outsiders rather than insiders. Finally, a technology architecture concentrated in satellite systems allowed comprehensive compromise by someone with the right access. All these factors aligned to create one of the most damaging espionage cases in American history. The case prompted reforms that reduced some vulnerabilities. However, it could not eliminate the fundamental tension between trust and security. This tension makes intelligence work both possible and dangerous in equal measure. The Black Notebook sits in its evidence locker. Its pages are filled with numbers that once represented America's most sensitive secrets. These secrets are now decoded, documented, and understood. The notebook is evidence of guilt and proof of betrayal. It also serves as a reminder that security is always a work in progress, never a finished state. As long as secrets exist, someone will try to steal them. As long as intelligence agencies recruit human beings, some percentage will betray trust. The Miller case was not the first betrayal, and it will not be the last. It was simply one of the most expensive, most damaging, and most avoidable cases. This could have been avoided if only someone had noticed the notebook earlier. It could have been avoided if only the background investigation had been more thorough. Or if only the security culture had been less trusting. If only.